Israel today stands in a place it hasn't been in for a long time. On one side, the port of Haifa, operated by a Chinese company. On the other, the fast rail line to Jerusalem built by foreign engineers. And, in the background, startups taking money from Beijing. These are no longer isolated projects. This is an entire web of connections, where every cable, every track, and every $1 million carries political consequences. Because when China enters Israel, somewhere nearby you can always see the shadow of the United States. And it's in that shadow that the real conflicts begin. Washington is looking at Tel Aviv with growing distrust. The Pentagon warns that Chinese investments are a risk. American senators ask bluntly, is Israel still our loyal ally? Israeli politicians are trying to balance. Some say it's just business. Others admit that every decision is like walking a tightrope over an abyss. Profits counted in billions are tempting, but loyalty to America is a matter of survival. And this is where the next act of this story begins. An act about politics, about pressure, about behind-the-scenes talks that decide whether Israel can drink coffee with Beijing and eat steak with Washington at the same time. And also about what happens when two giants start pulling a small country on the Mediterranean in opposite directions. Because the ports and the railways are only the beginning. Israel has always been a master of balancing. From the very first days of the state, its politicians had to live in a world of contradictions, taking help from the East while counting on the West, making deals with some Arabs while fighting others, building the economy in the shadow of war. But never before has this art of diplomatic gymnastics been as difficult as it became the moment China entered the game. Because Beijing is not an ordinary trading partner, it is a civilization state that thinks in terms of decades, even centuries. When the Chinese build a port in Haifa or invest in an Israeli startup, they're not thinking about tomorrow or the day after. They're thinking about what the world will look like in 2050. Israel, on the other hand, lives in the here and now, in a reality where each day brings the risk of another intifada, another crisis, another UN resolution. And it's within this gap that the political tensions shaking the foundations of the Israeli scene are born. Picture this scene. Jerusalem, the Knesset building, the National Security Committee room. On the table lie reports from Mossad and Shin Bet. They warn of Chinese espionage, of the risk of infrastructure dependence. Next to them, documents from the Ministry of Economy, where in black and white it is written that contracts with Beijing have brought billions in savings and accelerated development. The politicians look at one another and know one thing: every decision they make will have global consequences. On one side stand the supporters of cooperation with China. They say openly, "We can't rely on America forever. We need to diversify. China is the future, the biggest market, the biggest investor. If we turn away, we'll lose a chance that won't come again." In their eyes, Beijing is not an enemy, but a pragmatic partner who doesn't interfere in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, doesn't lecture on human rights, and doesn't moralize like Brussels or Washington. On the other side are those sounding the alarm. America is not just an ally. It's our protective umbrella. Without the Pentagon, without U.S. money, without the American veto at the UN, Israel wouldn't have survived. Every step toward China is a betrayal of trust that we've built for decades. If we overdo it, we'll wake up alone, without support at the crucial moment. And between these two camps, a political conflict is being born that doesn't disappear, only grows. Under Netanyahu's governments, the China issue kept coming back like a boomerang. One day the Prime Minister boasted of billion-dollar investments from Beijing. The next, under American pressure, he had to roll back agreements. Journalists called it dancing on a tightrope above a chasm. In the background of this game, scenes unfolded that were almost cinematic. In 2019, an American delegation with Secretary of State Mike Pompeo flew into Jerusalem. The closed-door meeting lasted several hours. The Americans didn't mince words. They warned that if Israel didn't limit cooperation with China, the alliance with the U.S. could be at risk. There was talk of withdrawing American ships from Haifa, of restricting intelligence cooperation. It was like a cold shower. But as soon as the Americans flew home, the Israeli press reported new Chinese contracts. Politics is one thing, business another. Israel needed investment. It needed rapid modernization. And Beijing was offering what no one else wanted to give. At the same time, public opinion began to split. Ordinary Israelis didn't think in geopolitical categories. For them, it mattered that the train finally ran faster, that goods in shops were cheaper, that new jobs appeared. But the more aware started asking, is this not too high a price? Will we wake up in a few years in a country that is too tightly bound to China to be able to say no? In the Knesset, the language grew sharper. Some politicians accused the government of selling Israel for pennies and turning into a colony of Beijing. Others replied that this was modern patriotism, opening up to the world and squeezing the maximum from every opportunity. The whole affair also had a personal dimension. Netanyahu, a master of political balancing, knew he had to play two pianos at once. Publicly, he emphasized friendship with America. Privately, he talked with Chinese investors. At times, it looked like a split personality. But that was the logic of a small state in a world of giants. The problem was that the world was changing. The United States increasingly saw China as rival number one. No longer just the factory of the world, but a power challenging Washington itself. In this logic, there was no room for half measures. Those with China could not be fully with America. Those playing with America had to be careful not to go too far with Beijing. Israel found itself exactly in the middle of this game. And that is what generated the greatest political tensions. Every agreement signed with a Chinese consortium became a topic for a U.S. congressional committee. Every contract with an American company raised questions in Beijing. Every infrastructure project became a symbol of a bigger puzzle. And then, in the shadow of these global frictions, another problem emerged: internal Israeli politics. Parties began using the China issue as a weapon in campaigns. Some accused the government of dependence on Beijing, others of giving in to American pressure. A topic that was supposed to be technical and economic suddenly became hot politics. This tension was visible in every debate. When ports were discussed, China was discussed. When railways were discussed, America was discussed. When data on rising investments appeared, the next question was always, and what does Washington say? On the streets of Israeli cities, few felt this geopolitics. But in politicians' offices, in intelligence rooms, in talks with U.S. and Chinese delegations, the tension hung in the air like a storm before the rain. And in this way, Israel entered the toughest phase of its contemporary history. Ports and railways were the beginning. High tech opened further doors, and politics turned all of it into a battlefield where there are no easy victories. Because if Israel goes too far toward Beijing, it may lose its greatest ally, America. If it yields too much to the U.S., it will lose billions in investments and a chance for growth. And if it tries to keep balancing, it risks that at some point the tightrope it walks will simply snap. And that is the core of the political tensions. These are not arguments about money or contracts. These are arguments about the future of the state. About whether in 2 decades Israel will still be an independent player, or just a pawn on the board of great powers. In Israel, the word security has a completely different weight than in most countries. For Europeans, national security is abstract strategies, long reports, and political debates. For Israelis, it's everyday life. It's soldiers on the streets, sirens at night, phone apps warning of rockets. It's the memory of wars fought not on another continent but over the fence, a few kilometers from home. That's why, when the topic of Chinese investments arose, the question of security became crucial. Because ports and railways are not just civilian infrastructure. They are also logistical channels for the army. Places where warships can dock, where data can flow, where monitoring systems can be hidden. Israeli intelligence, Mossad and Shin Bet, sounded the alarm from day one. Their reports warned that Chinese state-owned firms are not ordinary companies, that every construction contract is a potential Trojan horse, that the fiber optic cables they lay may hide listening systems, that the software they install in port terminals may be sending data to Beijing. These were not fantasies. In other parts of the world, from Africa to Europe, reports were coming out that Chinese infrastructure had a second layer. U.S. intelligence spoke loudly about cases where Huawei server farms had hidden backdoors enabling wiretaps. In Israel, those warnings echoed even louder. Imagine the port of Haifa. On one side, containers with oranges and electronics. On the other, a U.S. Sixth Fleet vessel at anchor. If the port's monitoring system is in the hands of a Chinese company, can anyone really be sure that data on the movements of naval units is not reaching Beijing? A storm broke out in the Israeli media. Military experts asked publicly, "Aren't we selling our national security for a few $100 million discount on port construction?" Retired generals on TV warned that Chinese presence in strategic locations is a greater threat than many of Hamas's rockets. The government replied, "Control over security remains in our hands. The Chinese build and operate, but the army and intelligence have their own systems." It sounded reassuring, but not everyone believed it. Because anyone familiar with the Chinese model knew that for Beijing, business and politics are one. To that was added U.S. pressure. The Pentagon made no secret of its anger. Generals said bluntly, "We will not dock in a port where the Chinese have access to data." These were not empty words. In 2019, there were real threats of withdrawing Sixth Fleet units from Haifa. Israel found itself in a no-win situation. Reject the Chinese and lose billions in investment. Go too far with them and risk the alliance with the U.S. Balancing on the edge of security became one of Tel Aviv's biggest policy problems. Meanwhile, another dimension of risk emerged: cyber. Chinese investments in high-tech meant Beijing gaining access to Israeli technologies. In cybersecurity, Israel was a world power. But if Chinese funds bought stakes in Israeli firms, could anyone be sure the source code wouldn't end up in Asia? This question was not theoretical. In 2020, Israeli media revealed that Chinese companies were showing interest in startups dealing with cyber and artificial intelligence. Experts warned, if we let them into our system, we won't have any secrets left. The problem was that in Israel, security is not only the army, it's also water, energy, and transport systems. The Chinese were investing in desalination companies, in solar plants, in logistics systems. Each of these investments could theoretically be used as a tool of pressure. Imagine a crisis situation: Israel in conflict with Iran, military pressure rising, and then a Chinese firm operating a container terminal or supplying software to the power grid suddenly has a technical problem. Is it an accident or a political signal? In geopolitics, such questions are not abstract. That's why the security issue became central. It was no longer just about the economy. It was about whether Israel was selling off pieces of its independence in exchange for short-term gains. Draft laws limiting Chinese investment in key sectors appeared in the Knesset. Under U.S. pressure, a special committee was set up to oversee deals with Beijing. But experts said openly, the milk has already been spilled. Ports are in Chinese hands, contracts signed, stakes in startups sold. Israel's national security, always based on military strength, technology, and the U.S. alliance, suddenly looked different. It was no longer about who has more tanks or rockets. It was about who has access to data, who controls infrastructure, who holds the fiber optic cables and power systems in their hands. Israel tried to reassure the public that everything was under control. But every new U.S. intelligence report reminded, Beijing doesn't invest out of altruism. Beijing invests to gain influence. And once gained, influence is hard to roll back. So national security in Israel became tightly intertwined with the China-U.S. Great Game. What once meant borders, the army and intelligence today also means ports, railways, and startups. In a world where wars are fought not only on battlefields but also in computer networks and trade contracts, security has become a much broader concept than ever before. For Israel, this is a lesson that can't be undone. Every Chinese crane in a port, every cable in a rail tunnel, every investment in a startup, it's not just economics. It's politics and risk. It's the question of whether national security in the 21st century can be defended solely with tanks and soldiers. Maybe the most dangerous weapon of the future won't fire a single shot. Maybe it will be enough that one day the port grinds to a halt, computer systems stop working, and the lights in Tel Aviv go out. And then everyone will understand that real national security begins where contracts end and control begins. From the very beginning of its existence, Israel has had an obsession with water. In a country where half the territory is desert and summer lasts almost all year, every liter of water is worth its weight in gold. That's not a metaphor. Here, water determines not only whether farmers can irrigate their fields. Here, water determines whether life is possible at all. Since the 1950s, Israel has built its identity as a state that managed to tame the desert. Kibbutzim, the legendary agricultural communes, were the symbol of this effort. Sand-covered fields of the Negev turned into green plantations thanks to complex irrigation systems. Israeli engineers invented drip irrigation systems that revolutionized agriculture worldwide. It was here that technologies were developed allowing plants to be watered with droplets rather than hectoliters. Water in Israel has always been a strategic issue. Successive governments treated it as a matter of national security. That's why a giant seawater desalination system was built, one of the largest in the world. That's why control over the Jordan River and the Sea of Galilee was sometimes a cause of war. That's why Israeli water technologies are exported today to Africa, India, and Latin America. And it was precisely into this most sensitive sector that the Chinese stepped. At first it looked harmless. Beijing wanted to invest in Israeli companies dealing with desalination, wastewater recycling, and agricultural technologies. In practice, this meant buying stakes in firms whose know-how was unavailable anywhere else in the world. The Chinese knew that water is the new oil of the 21st century, and that if they managed to acquire Israeli technologies, they could solve their own problems with desertification in northern China and polluted rivers. In 2015, a contract for private operation of the Sorek desalination plant, the largest such facility in Israel, made headlines. The tender was won by a company tied to Chinese capital. Drinking water for millions of Israelis, a key resource in a country that literally fights for every cup, was to be partially controlled by Beijing. It caused an uproar. The Daily Haaretz wrote plainly, "We are handing the tap to foreign hands." At the same time, Chinese funds began buying into Israeli agri-tech firms. They bought startups producing smart irrigation systems, soil moisture sensors, algorithms predicting crop yields. At first glance, it sounded like ordinary investment. But experts warned, those who control our agriculture control our food. Those who control our water control our lives. Farmers from kibbutzim started to rebel. They asked why technologies created by their grandparents were now landing in the hands of foreign investors. Journalists reminded readers that water in Israel is not business. It is national heritage. Politicians had to go on TV and explain that all strategic installations remained under state control. But public trust began to crack. And again, in the background stood America. The Pentagon and State Department warned that if China gained control over Israel's water systems, it would mean the potential risk of blackmail. Water is the most important weapon of the future, said U.S. experts. If Israel lets Beijing see into its systems, then in a crisis China will be able to turn off the tap. For the Chinese, these investments were more than business. They were part of a global strategy. Beijing knew the climate is changing, deserts are spreading, and millions in China may be left without water. Israeli technologies were a golden ticket, a shortcut allowing them to solve problems at home while building influence abroad. For Israel, it was a dilemma. On one hand, investments brought capital and growth. On the other, they raised the question, can you sell strategic resources like ordinary goods? Can you allow access to water, the symbol of survival, to be even partially dependent on foreign investors? In this area, the tension reached its peak. Because water in Israel is not just infrastructure. It's emotion, history, national memory. It's memories of the first kibbutzniks who planted tomatoes in the desert and watered them with droplets. It's wars over the Jordan, conflicts with Syria and Jordan, the founding myth of the state, So when headlines about Chinese investments in Israel's water systems appeared in newspapers, many felt that something was happening that touched the very heart of their identity. For the world, it might have looked like just another chapter in the story of the new Silk Road. For Israelis, it was a story about the tap in the kitchen, about the water in a bottle, about the glass on the table, because it's in such details that great geopolitics is played out. Today, Israel is like a garden in the desert. Green, full of life, brimming with innovation, but surrounded on all sides by sandstorms. Chinese cranes in Haifa, tunnels carved by foreign workers, startups financed with capital from Beijing, and even water, the country's most sacred resource, slowly wrapped in the red threads of the Belt and Road Initiative. At first glance, it's all benefits, cheaper investments, faster development, billions of dollars flowing into the Israeli economy. But the longer you look, the more clearly you see that every signature on a contract has its price. The price is loyalty to America. The price is national security. Sometimes the price is your own independence. For the average resident of Tel Aviv or Haifa, this is often invisible. Water flows from the tap, trains run, highways widen. But in politicians' offices, in Mossad briefing rooms, and in the Pentagon, no one has illusions. Israel is playing in the biggest chess game of our time. And in that game, the pawns are no longer just ports or railways. The pawn is the entire state. This is only the beginning of the story. Because next, we enter even more sensitive areas. Transport corridors, alternatives to the Suez Canal, competition with new Indian and U.S. projects. And the biggest question of all, can Israel really be a friend of Washington and a partner of Beijing at the same time? In the next part, we'll see what happens when the new Silk Road meets Israel's ambition to be a hub of the world, and how thin the line is between opportunity and the loss of independence.